Good evening, fourth graders, and welcome to your first ever Flipping the Classroom lesson. I'm Miss Kessler, and I will be doing your first flipped lesson this year. Before we get started, let's just go over a few things, a few reminders of what your expectations are at home, so that we can make sure that this is an easy flow from home into the classroom. The first thing I want you to remember is you should be taking notes through this lesson. When you're taking notes, I'll tell you which section to respond in and which section to write your notes in. So in your notebook, you have broken it up into 4 sections. You have a global section where you're connecting your math skills to the real world. You should have a vocabulary section where you're writing any vocabulary terms that we learned today from today's lesson into that section. You also have a practice section, and in that practice section you are also going to write the practice problem so that I can see your thought process as you worked forward through that problem. And then your last section is an optional section, and that means if you don't have anything to put there, you don't have to. All the other sections, the first 3, are mandatory. You have to do them. So that last section, the optional section, is called the questions or suggestions section. So if you have questions that you might have during the lesson and you want to ask me something, I'm not there. Write it down and ask me tomorrow morning. The suggestions are for your classmates. Maybe you have a strategy that helped you solve your math problems for homework and you want to help your friends tomorrow. Write those down. Help them out. Another thing I want you to remember as you're watching the video, you have the freedom of pausing at any time. So if I'm moving a little too fast, pause it. Take a breather and go back to it and press play when you're ready. The next thing, you can rewind. So maybe I'm speaking too fast. You could rewind and replay what you missed when I was speaking too quickly. And lastly, if you get through this video and you're still having a hard time understanding, maybe just watching it one more time will help you. Let's get started. I'm really excited. So our first flipped classroom lesson is multiplying by a 1-digit number. Before we get started with multiplying by that 1-digit number, let's talk a little bit about what multiplication is. So when I think of multiplication, I think of building on of groups of numbers. So we do that through repeated addition. So multiplication is the building on of groups of numbers through repeated addition. So our numbers are going to be growing. Our answers to our multiplication problems should be much larger than the numbers we're multiplying. Here's your first task. Under the global section in your notebook, you're going to respond to this question. And the question is, when do we multiply? You're going to give me a real life scenario of when you think you would need to multiply in the real world. Remember that global connection, connecting math to the real world. When would we have to build on of groups of numbers through repeated addition? When would we have to do that? You can pause the video now and take a few minutes to jot down your answers or your responses. Okay, so now that you have kind of an understanding of when you would use multiplication in the real world, now let's go back and see what you've been used to seeing in multiplication. A lot of times when we talk of multiplication, we see multiplication problems written like this. 3 times 4 going left to right, or 4 times 3 going up to down. And we have our equal signs that look like this if it's going left to right, and our equal sign looking like this if it's top to bottom. These are simple facts, are facts that we should have memorized and we should be able to move quickly through. So if I'm looking at 3 times 4, I should be able to tell you that 3 times 4 is equal to 12, and it should be a quick fact. But as you're moving forward in 4th grade, these facts are going to be useful. We're going to continue to use them. But we're going to build upon our learning now. We're going to make our learning more challenging. We're going to become more challenged in our learning so that we can do much larger math problems. So in 4th grade, you're going to start to see multiplication problems that look more like this. Remember, I said as you're growing older, as you're getting older, more mature, you want to start challenging yourself. So that 3 times 4, that 4 times 3, yeah, that was easy. That's going to be quick, simple problems for you. Now let's step it up. Let's move it to a new level. And let's look at a problem like this. So we have 417 times 7. That's taking a much larger number and multiplying it by 7. That's going to be challenging, but we're going to learn how to do it in this lesson. Or taking a large number like 372 and multiplying it by 5. Let's take a look at some vocabulary terms, because we're going to be using a lot of these vocabulary terms to describe how we solve for our answer and to discuss with our friends what we're doing in multiplication now as a 4th grader. So the first vocabulary word that I want you to look at is what it means to be the first number in a multiplication problem, because that has a name. So the first number we see in a multiplication problem is called the multiplicand. The multiplicand is the number that we are repeating, okay? So this is the number that we're going to be making much larger, and we're going to be doing it by looking at this number and saying this number, and in this case, 7 different times, okay? So a multiplicand, and you can take this time to write your vocabulary terms down. Remember, you can pause it, or you can rewind and write your vocabulary terms down after. So the first number in a multiplication problem is called the multiplicand. And when we are multiplying the multiplicand, we are repeating that number. So that's the number we're going to be repeating over and over again. The next number in a multiplication problem is called the multiplier. And the multiplier is how much we are multiplying by. So in this case, we are multiplying the multiplicand 7 different times, okay? So the multiplicand is what is repeating, and this is how many times it is repeating. And lastly, we have the answer to a multiplication problem. So all of the answers to multiplication problems are called the product. So what is the product? The product is the answer to the multiplication problem. Go ahead and make sure that you have all of these notes taken in your notebooks now. Alright, let's try our first example. So we know that the top number in a multiplication problem is the multiplicand. And the bottom number, or the second number in a multiplication problem, is the multiplier. The multiplicand is the number that repeats itself. And the multiplier is how many times it repeats itself. In addition, when we're adding bigger numbers, we use the strategy of looking from top to bottom and adding our place values. In multiplication, it's different. We use a strategy called the broken windshield wiper. And the broken windshield wiper goes from right to left in this kind of arched way. And it stops once the place values have ended in the multiplicand. So the first multiplication problem that we start to look at is 4 times 9. Remember, we're going in that arch direction. So 4 times 9. And this is when your multiplication facts need to be fast. I know that 4 times 9, or 9 times 4 is 36. When I write 36, it really means that I have 6 ones and 3 tens. So I'm going to write that down. Now I put the 3 up top in the tens place because it represents 3 tens. Don't forget about that 3. That 3 is going to be very important in just a minute. So let's just recap real fast. We went from the 4 and multiplied 4 times 9, and that gave us 36. 6 ones and 3 tens. Now we're going to continue on that arch. Remember, because multiplication is different. We don't go top to bottom. We go in this arch direction from right to left. So we're going to go from 4 times 2. 4 times 2 is 8. Now remember I said don't forget about this number that we added up top to the tens place. Now is the time we're going to do something with that. So now that we know that 4 times 2 is 8, we have to add these extra tens. So we have 4 times 2 is 8 plus 3. So 8 plus 3 is 11. And we're going to write that down below. So we have 11. If I had an extra place value in the hundreds place, I would write the extra 1 up top, but I don't. So I can just put it down below and say that the product of 29 times 4 is equal to 116. Now remember, the multiplicand is the number that repeats itself. So 29 is going to repeat itself 4 different times because the multiplier tells us how many times we're multiplying it. So we have 29 plus 29 plus 29, 4 times 29 equals 116. Pretty awesome.